In this episode of ChronCube, we'll be doing a double feature to discuss two launch titles based on licensed properties: Batman Vengeance and Tarzan Untamed, both brought to us courtesy of Ubisoft. Back in 2001, Ubisoft was a bit of an industry darling. Rather than the ubiquitous and monolithic company they are today, back at the turn of the century, Ubisoft was still a fresh-faced up-and-comer known primarily for its Rayman series. Enough so that at least one reporter referred to the place as the house that Rayman built. With the success of Rayman 2 across all platforms at the time, Ubisoft began to branch out and try its hand at climbing the ladder to becoming a bigger, more prestigious, and more successful publisher. They started out the way many smaller niche publishers at the time did, by taking a risk localizing and publishing smaller games from Japanese studios that otherwise might be passed over for a Western release. And this included the Evolution series on the Dreamcast, as well as the critically acclaimed Grandia 2, which the company paid handsomely for to secure the rights. But this risk was also balanced out by much more conservative investments in games based on licensed movie and television properties, particularly those aimed at younger audiences. And this included Batman Beyond, Return of the Joker, The Road to El Dorado, Disney's Dinosaur, and Planet of the Apes, all of which were pumped out for either the aging PlayStation or Nintendo 64. In early August of 2001, Ubisoft hosted a press event to unveil its lineup of games for the coming year, with a particular focus on their plans for the next-generation systems due to release in just a few months. They announced that they had plans for 19 GameCube games in the future, but on that day they only had 3 to show. 2 of these games were Batman Vengeance and Tarzan Untamed. The other was a Rayman spin-off title. The advantage they had in their corner was that the company confirmed they would be using their Open Spaces engine for both Tarzan and Batman. This was the next generation engine that they had built and already tested on the Dreamcast and PlayStation 2 with both Rayman 2 and Donald Duck going quackers. So they certainly had a strong technical base for their developers to build good games off of. The question would really only be, would they make a good game? We'll tackle that question one at a time. Batman is one of those properties, like Star Wars, that seems inexorably attracted to the video game format. From the early NES and Genesis games, based on the 1989 Tim Burton film, to the more recent range of shovelware titles pumped out by Acclaim and Ubisoft themselves, Batman video games had a very mixed reputation at best. In the case of this game, the development team clearly picked wisely from the available lineup of Batman media at the time, and opted to base the game off of one of the animated series that had proven to be critically acclaimed during the 1990s. The game would actually be based specifically on the New Batman Adventures series that aired for just 2 years from 1997 to 1999, fitting in neatly between the original Batman the Animated Series and Batman Returns. The game also did the due diligence to feature all the proper voice talent in order to capture the spirit of the show as well. Batman Vengeance starts you out the way any good 3D game of its vintage should, in a small space where you can quickly hit all the buttons on the controller in order to figure out what they do. After that, though, the game actually takes a stab at a fairly cinematic style of presentation, as the credits for the game begin to pop up tied to your progression walking through the first intro stage. It's apparent the developers were quite heavily into the idea of getting you to play an episode of the cartoon, and for the most part they actually succeed. Although at times the environment can be a bit sparse and lacking in enough detail that it makes it kind of hard to discern where exactly you should be heading next. On the topic of playing the cartoon, the game looks at first glance like it's using cel shading, since the game has a very cartoonish art style, but on closer inspection the game isn't actually using cel shading techniques, which is known specifically for drawing lines around polygon models akin to objects drawn on paper. Instead, it appears the game is using the real old-fashioned polygonal trick of simply flat shading whole objects and models in order to give the kind of single color gradient that might be used in animation, especially computer-aided animation. While this is all pretty nice and captures the atmosphere of the animated show, the game also captures the darkness of the Dark Knight's universe perhaps a tad too much, since adjusting the brightness in the game could be considered an absolute must in order to be able to play. The game even puts the brightness slider in your face during the introduction rather than hiding it in a back menu. Once you get past the formalities, it would appear the developers of the game took a good deal of inspiration from the very well-received Spider-Man game that had been developed by Neversoft and published on the PlayStation and Dreamcast in the year prior. The game gives you a 3D world to run around in, largely by giving you a series of different platforms, like buildings, to run on top of or inside of, with a long drop to a certain depth if you leave these platforms. This makes great use of lesser graphical resources to give the illusion of a big open world without actually letting you run around that entire world. Of course, it wouldn't be a Batman game without giving you access to a plethora of his gadgets, and this game certainly does that. While you definitely need to pay attention and read the tutorials to wrap your head around using the triggers and joystick to access your menu of different items, once you train with them a bit and get the hang of it, it's a system that you can pretty intuitively work with. It's the product of an era when each game presented you with its own bespoke control scheme, and you had to dedicate at least a little investment up front into learning them. Although some of the mechanics are a bit questionable, as key items like the batarangs and the grappling hook are only usable by switching into a first-person mode, fairly needlessly complicating things. The combat is also fairly bog-standard, with you simply mashing the B button like a simple beat-em-up game to wear your opponent's health down while they guard, or if you get a little more brave, you can wait for themselves to open up right before they strike in order to get a few better hits in. Upon its release, the game got some wildly different receptions and reviews, with some outfits giving it scores as high as an 8, and others dumping it down in the 5s and 6s. The full answer certainly lies between these two, with a pretty average 7 being my decision here. There's nothing broken or wrong about the game, it even has some good art direction and captures the original material style pretty well. But it's also nothing extraordinary. It's certainly not as fluid or smooth or has as nicely tuned a fighting system as the Spider-Man game that it's very clearly meant to compete with. But for Batman fans, it could certainly serve as a good extra dose for those that crave more of the animated series. A respectable middle ground title to fill your GameCube library at launch while you wait for more games to come out. Outside of the launch window, though, this game would have a much harder time justifying its purchase. Tarzan Untamed, on the other hand, certainly deserves the very middling 50 to 60% scores that it universally received. The original Tarzan game on the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 had very clearly set itself up as a very, very kid-friendly title, opting out of the 3D platformer genre entirely and sticking to a very linear 2D path, albeit with polygonal graphics. Now, this game tries to open that up a little bit, technically leaving you in a very tiny 3D space, but in reality the game is still very linear, with only one straight path through the level, along the trees and the vines and all the way to the very end. This seems like a puzzling choice. Why make some 3D spaces but maintain such a linear structure? Now, this choice makes a lot more sense when you consider that the developers were attempting to mesh two styles of games together at the exact same time. Right off the bat, when you begin the game, you're given the choice between Tarzan's story mode or Turk's challenge mode. The story mode is very clearly modeled after the first game, but the challenge mode appears to read like they were going for adding some kind of extreme sports twist on the game, with you even receiving points for pulling off tricks during the level, and even straight up including extreme sports conventions like grinding. This odd choice of putting two kinds of games into one package might be an acceptable if odd mix, but not for the fact that the challenge mode simply recycles the same levels from the story mode, meaning the levels had to be designed to work in both modes. Once I switched from the story mode to the challenge mode and realized this, I understood what they had done and why the levels were so linear. Now, graphically, the game is not as acceptable as Batman, simply due to the lack of a strong art direction here. Rather than trying to do something akin to cartoon shading, or at least recognizing the limits of what graphics could reasonably achieve to replicate such a rich, animated film, the game engine looks a lot like the last generation game on steroids with boosted polygon counts and marginally better texture work. It's really a bit sloppy overall. Now, there's little to complain about with regards to the controls, since the game is so linear, camera concerns and directional controls are not a problem. The sound and the soundtrack are also bog standard and lifted right from the movie and the previous game, and the voice acting is very clearly being outsourced to sound-alikes rather than getting the original cast. Now, these two games make a good juxtaposition for the highs and the lows that can be expected of average licensed tie-in video games. One definitely appears to come from a team that was putting what effort they could into a franchise they clearly knew and cared about, and they made a pretty decent attempt to make a worthwhile game with their time. The other is much more clearly a more half-assed effort made on a deadline in order to fulfill a contract to push a particular product.